I repeat for the last time. To understand me, you'll have to swallow the world. Salman Rushdie.
Right after my father was in Congress, I got to work for a year on the Hill. And I remember walking down a hallway, and there was JFK as a senator walking the other direction in the hallway. And I wanted to just stop and go, I'll follow you, see where you're going. But it was that moment of, wow, look at him.
Jody Olsen called her Peace Corps memoir A Million Miles. And while the distance from her traditional Mormon upbringing in Utah and a rural Tunisian health clinic may not have been a literal million miles, it probably felt like even more. But those miles brought countless lessons, all of which she put to use when decades later she became the Peace Corps' 20th director. I'm Christopher Wurst, and this is
Soft
Power.
Powerful.
Soft
Power.
Powerful stories.
Powerful.
Soft
Powerful stories.
I was actually born at 18th and I Street in Washington, D.C. I sometimes tell people I was born in a basket in the Metro Center. But when I was 6 months old, the family moved to Utah. And so I grew up in Utah, in Salt Lake City, as a good Mormon and all the elements that come with that tradition. My father, when he was 12 years old, his father was a senator. And so he grew up in Washington and got to do special things. And one of the special things he got to do at 12 was to go spend a year in Paris. That totally captivated him. Not enough to take me to Paris, but he was determined I was going to learn French. And he talked about how wonderful France was and how wonderful Paris was. Second, my birth mother left when I was 3, and I didn't have any contact with her for 20 years. The only thing I knew about her at all, knew nothing, except I knew that she lived in Paris. And so growing up, I would make up all these stories about this person who was my mother, who did all these things in Paris. So between the made-up stories about this mother I didn't know and my father talking all the time, the curiosity for the other stayed very strong. When I was young, about 11 years old, I went with my aunt, who was head of Lutheran Social Services in Salt Lake City, Utah. And I decided after spending a day with her that I wanted to be a social worker. You know, with kids my age, I always seemed to be counseling them, even when we were all little tots. So I knew that's always what I wanted. Now, my life never quite got that way, but I did get my degree in social work. But it also suggested to me I was interested in cultures, people, how people reacted, what is the intersection between the individual and the community. My curiosity has always been about people.
Did you, besides your aunt, did you have a particular role model or maybe a hero growing up?
For me, it was my father. He was a high church official when I was growing up, and so he got asked to give talks. He would tell me how to prepare talks, and his stories of typing in the phrases he was going to use for his talks, and they would be on 3x5 cards, and he called them his train cars. And so he had maybe 110, 120 train cars. And so as he was getting ready every Sunday, he would pick 9 or 10 that seemed to suit that situation and make his little train. And then we would go, and he'd always tell me, these are the important people that are going to be here, and I'm going to introduce you. And I learned how he talked, how he looked at the audience, how he cared for people, and how he put his little trains together. It gave me courage, because I was very shy, strong introvert, that if I really wanted to speak, which I did, there's ways to do it when it doesn't come comfortably. And so I got to see him in leadership roles when he was running for Congress, just saw what leadership looked like. And I'm forever grateful for him for that. When I was in high school, my father was elected to Congress. And so the family moved back to Kensington, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. So I finished high school here in Washington, and then I went back to the University of Utah because that's the place that all good Utah people go, if not BYU. And from there, I joined the Peace Corps. I was a junior at the University of Utah. I was engaged to be married, and I was going to follow the traditional Mormon track and stay in Salt Lake and have a bunch of kids and do all those good things. Well, I was at a sorority dinner, and there was this guy sitting in this chair with the president of the sorority. And he looked a little bit scruffy, and none of us could figure out why he was there. And as I was eating my dessert, my chocolate cake, he stood up and he talked for about 15 minutes. And he talked about Niger, and he talked about the rural areas, and he talked about his 2 years of life there. This is 1964. This is back in the beginning. And I was fascinated watching him, and he sat down, and I looked at my cake, and I thought, as I took that last bite, I want to do this. I knew I had to do it. It was that moment that told me there was something in the world more than being in Salt Lake City, Utah. So the next day I said to my fiance, guess what happened to me last night? And as we talked it through, he said, okay, I think we can both do that. And it was 2 years later, we went in the Peace Corps.
What a cool, adaptable guy.
Oh, wonderful, cool, adaptable guy. Yeah, I think there must have been something there that he wanted to get out of Salt Lake City also.
In the mid-1960s, Tunisia was a young republic pursuing an ambitious project of secular modernization and development. After its independence from France, it faced serious challenges, from rural poverty, high unemployment, and the strains of rapid social reforms.
So what I thought it was going to be, and again, it's back at a time that you didn't know the country existed until you started pulling out a paper map and saying, well, where is this little country that's shoehorned between Algeria and Libya? And so I had almost no expectations because I didn't know what any of it was. I had nothing to draw on. I had no pictures. And then you find yourself in this country where the sounds are strange, the call to prayer is strange. And I remember right at the beginning that everybody had a lot of cloth on. Of course, the women were fully covered, and the men might as well have been fully covered except for their face because of all the jubbas and the hats and such. And so I was walking around that first day or two with a lot of cloth shuffling around. And I'm going, where are the people behind all this cloth shuffling around? Then to go into the first day of school, because I had gotten my degree in education, so I had done student teaching, and I know how to stand in front of a room and have a bunch of students and, in theory, teach them something. But here was a whole group of Tunisian boys. They were all 14 years old. They were getting their first year of English. They already spoke classical Arabic, their own kind of Arabic that you had in Tunisia, and French. And so in their heads was, why are we learning a fourth language? This is before internet, and you didn't have any reason to want to learn any English. And here stands this teacher who thinks she's going to teach this to you. So the whole idea of teaching became something completely different than I understood before I went. Well, what happened was I learned their culture and they learned mine. I learned how they learned, and they learned how I taught. Just to give a couple of examples, was I decided that I would teach English only in English, because I didn't want them to know that my French was horrific and my Arabic was non-existent, because then I wouldn't have any value, and they would go, oh, gee, she doesn't even speak our language. I used a lot of chalk figures on the board. Chalk figures of donkeys, chalk figures of rugs, of the food. But I was always using the pictures of what I was seeing and feeling in Tunisia. So we get into a month of this, or 2 months of this, And they would go, Mrs., you like our food? Well, I go, of course. Mrs., you like our rugs? Well, of course. And I always wore a Tunisian coat, and it still smelt of lanolin because it had just come off the sheet probably 2 weeks before. So it was this very homemade, heavy coat. You like our clothes. Mrs., you really like our clothes. Well, what this exchange in very limited English was them saying, oh, you like us. I was the first non-Tunisian that cared about them and cared about their culture, cared about what they did every day, observed what they did every day, and drew pictures of it on the blackboard. And so what was beginning to happen was a relationship of them reaching out to me as a person because I had been reaching to them and I was respecting who they were. And that was so fundamental to me in learning that building relationships, establishing trust, showing your own vulnerabilities is necessary for any kind of learning to happen, any sort of teaching or training to happen, because they're not going to listen to me if they didn't trust me. They weren't going to listen to me if they didn't discover that I couldn't spell. Mrs., it's an E, not an I. It's after 2 months of learning English. And in that kind of moment, they were saying things to me that they could not say in any of their classes because their other classes were all so formal and so precise, and you just sit there and you take notes and the teacher says everything. But they discovered that they could say, Mrs., it's, because Madame would always be it in French, so I became Mrs., that they could comment on what I was commenting on. So in effect, I was teaching a teaching process. None of that I thought was going to happen to me in Tunisia. I didn't understand what it meant to go into a place that culturally, linguistically, religiously, traditionally, historically could not be more different. When I was a Peace Corps volunteer, I was trying to figure out how to survive in the beginning. I was trying to figure out how to stay warm because Tunisia does get cold in the winter and they have no heat. I was figuring out how to speak enough that I could buy food and negotiate getting a place to stay and negotiate interacting with the students. What comes in that process was that I was needing to adapt myself to who they were. Now, in adapting, I knew I was an American. I knew I was not going to cover, even as all the Tunisian women did. I was always going to speak with a horrific accent, and I always walked like an American, and I didn't look like anybody there. So in that, I had to recognize that even as I was looking at them and trying to get clues, they were looking at me and going, who is she and what's she doing here? But also, isn't she funny? She doesn't know how to hold a teacup. She walks with a strange walk. Or why does she spend all that time looking at those fresh spices when we just go in and buy them, but she smells them and she tries to figure out which ones to get, and she doesn't know what they taste like. So I knew that they were all looking at me, and I found it fun. I mean, for example, I used to go down and buy olive oil. Tunisia's olive oil is exported all over the world as being some of the best. I highly recommend Tunisian olive oil. They saved for the Tunisians, out of the big vat, the worst olive oil. So it's the kind that it didn't look all pretty. But I fell in love with the olive oil, and so I would take my bottle and I would stand in line with all the other people, mostly guys, because they would do the shopping because women didn't go out, to buy this olive oil. And I remember this Tunisian guy turning to me and he goes, "What are you doing here?" "Well, I'm buying olive oil." "Why are you buying this olive oil?" "Well, I like this olive oil." "Yeah, but you're not supposed to buy this olive oil." He said, "Well, I don't know what else to buy." And it started these conversations because they didn't expect me to be in that line with them buying that olive oil. I became like a third sex because no one knew what to do with me. I got involved in family planning my second year, and so with that, I started learning the intimate words of colloquial Tunisian Arabic, just to talk to the women about family planning. Well, that was about all I knew in colloquial Arabic, were these kinds of words. And so I would be with women out in back of the little places where they lived because I wanted to thank them for cooking meals. And we would get involved in conversations about children and sex because that was the language I knew. And laughing away, but it was just us women. Well, I would have conversation with the guys. Particularly, I would be with guys at tea shops because I didn't fit what the Arabic women or what the Tunisian women were, but they were interested in who I was. So I would get all these intimate conversations that they had to offer, laughing like a guy. So I could be a guy and I could be a woman and have a whole different set of conversations because I was neither in their head because I didn't follow any of their traditions. And so in effect, I became safe. And that was what was so enjoyable for me and how I could learn culture and how do you relate with people that are so different. Because in part, I didn't fit anywhere. And that was fine with me. I really liked that. I learned several elements about being a team member and to a certain extent about what is it to be a leader from my 2 years as a Peace Corps volunteer that I carried with me. On the early parts of any kind of emerging leadership opportunity is to know who you're working with and what are their needs and wants, as well as the organizational needs and wants. So I learned to listen, always listen. What is it that's important to those that you're working with or leading? Learn to observe. How are their eyes? How is their face? Did they come in the room strongly? Did they come in the room weakly? Really assessing the environment in which you're working. That came so dramatically from Peace Corps because my survival was dependent on those observations. Because I couldn't trust what I had learned in Utah. I had to learn to survive in an environment that gave me no cues. And I had to learn the cues, and I learned the cues by listening and watching and asking questions that I didn't know the answer to and questions of strangers. So leadership is very dependent on that. I helped set up the family planning program my second year as a Peace Corps volunteer. So I was taking on a leadership role. I needed to get permission from the Minister of Health. I needed to build the trust of the doctors who worked in the maternity clinic. I had to get the trust of the women that I was talking to. I needed to get the trust of the Peace Corps country director, whom I was asking to do something that he's going, oh my heavens, we would never do that. So I was already taking a role that was a little different than what I was originally assigned. But I fed in all those pieces I had been learning the first year of respect, of trust, of understanding. The doctors in the clinic were from Hungary. And, the Hungarian doctors were, I'm not sure how excited they were to be working in a clinic in Sousse, Tunisia, maternity clinic. But they were very funny. They would fill up condoms with water and have balloon fights up and down the hallway. And then they would go splat and everybody would get wet. But I had to understand where they were coming from because I needed their support in order to go and talk to women and be part of the activities there. So I spent a little time with these Hungarian doctors. I think I even played balloons with them once. So what I've done and my various roles, leadership roles, have really come from what I learned in those 2 years about honoring and respecting other people and trusting them and teaching them.
I have to say, Hungarian doctors with condom water balloons was not on my bingo card for this interview. I want to ask you to think about a time as the director of the Peace Corps, when you were in the field and when you had a particularly proud moment where you like had a pinch me moment at what you were seeing and knowing that you were leading this organization.
We had just opened the program in Namibia, and Peace Corps had been there probably about 18 months at that point. And so I was meeting with the Minister of Education, and we had about 50, 60 volunteers there then who were teaching English and working with the English teachers. And so I asked, have you seen any difference, or do you have any impressions for Peace Corps having been here now for 18 months? And I try to ask the question very openly because I don't want to guide an answer. I want it to be what they think of. Well, when I asked the question, what was in my head was, the curriculum, and, their teachers are feeling more confident, or the students are clarifying their English a little bit better. I mean, these elements were what was running through my head when I asked the question. And he looked at me and immediately said, "Oh, yes, I've seen quite a difference. You are the first foreigners," and in this case he said white people, although we were not all quite white people, "that have come to our country and learned our language, learned our local tribal languages. You've given us dignity for who we are because you joined us in our languages." I wanted to cry because it was the core, an example of the core of what Peace Corps is about. We do the formal things. We also share our individuality. But our process of learning, and so few people do that, for him to notice beyond any of the other technical things we did, it was we respected them with the language of their heritage. And I was so proud of my leadership role and the thousands of volunteers who take the time to learn the traditions and the language, because that's what marks time. That's what builds the relationship. That's what builds the friendships across the countries, more than whether they can conjugate a verb or get the seed correctly in the ground. It's that relationship. When I was in Senegal, I was in Chas, Senegal, and the Peace Corps volunteer was a woman, and her family traditions came from Japan. So she was first generation Japanese American. And so she was, let's say, slight of build. And she was an agriculture volunteer. And she was working with a farmer who had a particular hectare of land that he was doing experimental farming with that USAID had funded. And so she was to work with him. She'd been there about a year. And I spent about 3 hours with the two of them out there on the land. Her host family was the next door neighbor to the farmer. She had been working with the kids, and she had learned the language, I forget which language for that part of Senegal, and had been with this farmer every day. And a year into it, there they are, walking up and down the furrows of whatever it was they were planting, some kind of vegetables. Spinach is what they often do, and then certain kinds of trees they were growing. And I was watching the two of them talk back and forth, and then she would translate to me because they were talking in the local language. And what I had appreciated in the two of them is that they had become best buddies. Now, he's about 6'1" and weighs maybe 240 pounds, and she wasn't quite that big. They could not look more different and be dressing more differently. And their gaits up and down the furrows could not be more different. But they would kind of lean into each other like two best friends. And he would put out an idea, and she would then have an idea, and then she would, and he. And he commented to us that she had had the idea of bringing the primary school kids over to see what they were doing and actually help water the spinach or whatever it was, maybe once a week. And then he described what had happened to him because of saying, yes, let's do this. And what he had learned and additional suggestions that the kids had given him and he had given the kids. It was that perfect moment, which was it took her almost a year to be to that point, watching that they knew each other and the partnership was strengthening his farming, which he said very much. He was much, much better. But a lot of it was his own ideas, but his own ideas through her questions. She was a catalyst and a friend, and it was the essence of what a volunteer in a community is about that makes both stronger.
That means we're coming to the end of the episode, but I don't want to stop before I give Jody the chance to respond to our Aunt Deb.
We give a lot, and often it is in far-off, obscure places. What do we get back from all of this giving?
If I'm sitting across the Thanksgiving table from a dubious family member who goes, why should we put our money there? I talk about, I think, several elements. One, we are in a country for 2 years, and we, as the Americans in that country for 2 years, learn more than we give. We think we give, but because we listen and learn, we bring that back to the United States. And I say that we have the rest of our lives to give back that learning in the United States. And I'll give an example of HRSA, which is in HHS. It is the public health part of the U.S. government and works with public health throughout the United States. So the example I give is the head of HRSA talked to me, and he said, we like to hire returned Peace Corps volunteers as much as we want to hire anybody. And there's a reason that most of the health programs around the world are community-based, and that there is a health person who is the first line of contact, and then you build outward. But so much of the health and health prevention and small-scale health treatment comes at the community level with this community health leader. And he said, in the United States, we don't have that model, and it works against us for illness prevention and for small-scale medical situations. We need the return volunteer to be helping train and build the system in the United States that's closer to one that we think we can take better health care of community members. So I would say to the relative, this is just one example of technical work that we bring back. I talk about the number that go into education, that become principals, regional leaders, teachers, that can honor the variety of ethnic backgrounds that are in the classroom, and how they reach out in particular to bring immigrants and first generation into an understanding in a classroom. So I talk about what we professionally give back in the United States. Two, I mentioned that our spirit of service and volunteerism. One of the studies, I guess it was about 20 years ago, of American habits, we at one point got them to identify returned Peace Corps volunteers in this nationwide survey and discovered that returned volunteers had a statistically higher representation of volunteering than the average American, and how a lot of who we are and saving our communities in the U.S. are based on that volunteerism. Then I say, third, America needs friends. America needs colleagues, countries to sell things to. We need people to support us when we have a political issue that we need to be taking care of. Those friends that come in part from Peace Corps and Peace Corps serving in those countries builds a longer-term relationship between the United States and these countries. I was with the ambassador from Indonesia to the U.S. here at the embassy in Washington, and he had invited returned Peace Corps volunteers from Indonesia, and of course they were wearing all their jackets that were so gorgeous and wonderful fabric. And he turned to everyone and said, I almost don't have a role here in the United States because all the people with these wonderful jackets on are the ambassadors to the United States. They bring our country into the houses and schools and communities all across America. And we can honor America because we honor those volunteers that spent 2 years with us in our country. Now, if the relative hasn't gone to sleep by then, I'll probably go on. But those are 3 critical ways of how important Peace Corps is that goes beyond just providing technical assistance.
Josephine Jody Olsen served as the Peace Corps' director from 2018 to 2021. Because of the COVID pandemic, she led the successful 9-day evacuation of all 7,000 Peace Corps volunteers from 61 countries back to the United States. Jody was a Peace Corps volunteer in Tunisia from 1966 to 1968 and has served the agency in 5 other senior positions. Her memoir about her Peace Corps service is titled A Million Miles, My Peace Corps Journey. Today, she co-chairs Women of Peace Corps Legacy, chairs the Peace Corps Park Advisory Committee, and the University of Maryland College of Education Board of Visitors. She's also on the Maryland Governor's Commission for Service and Volunteerism. She received a Bachelor of Science from the University of Utah and a Master's and PhD from the University of Maryland. Thank you so much for listening. We appreciate it. If you haven't followed us already wherever you get your podcasts, please do so. Please leave a rating. It means a lot. And not only that, but it helps get those algorithms moving this show to the ears that need to hear it, or that we would like to hear it. You can find out much more by visiting our website at softpowerfulstories.org. There you can learn more about our guests, see pictures of them in action, find out the music that we use, and, of course, leave feedback. We would love to hear from you. My friend Kathy Zilski voices Dubious Aunt Deb, who, of course, she is nothing like, but she does it perfect. My name is Christopher Wurst. I'm the host and producer of Soft Powerful Stories. Until next time.